So I asked and you answered. You want me to do this video to conclude this series. So we're going to talk today in a bit more depth. We're going to take a deep dive into what is probably the Beatles' most famous song. I mean, feel free to disagree if you can think of a one that's more famous than this. But in terms of sales of an actual single, this is their biggest selling single. So here we go. For the last time, welcome back to the White Album in Depth. This is episode 32, Hey Jude. So before we start the story of Hey Jude, I've got to ask, does anyone actually not know what this song is about? I mean, is there anyone watching this video who's actually watching this thinking, I have no idea what Hey Jude is about, and I'm about to learn it because, I mean, I'm not being funny, Paul McCartney has told this story God knows how many times over the years, till the cows come home. Even John has told the story of this song. George and Ringo have probably told it as well. I mean, it's not exactly an uncommonly told story, but we're going to do it again here anyway today. You're going to get to hear about it. So yeah, let's get into the story here. So we begin in May 1968, and as is quite well documented, John Lennon in this month left his first wife Cynthia for Yoko Ono. Now in leaving Cynthia, he would also leave behind his 5-year-old son Julian. Now all four Beatles have been close with Cynthia. They'd known her since before they were famous. She'd been one of their earliest supporters. She'd been there since the very beginning. And that was it now, she was kind of out the picture. And Paul was also very close with Julian. In fact, of all the Beatles, he was probably the closest with Julian. He was probably closer to Julian than what John was. So one day in June 1968, Paul decided that he would drive out to Weybridge to visit Cynthia and Julian to see how they're doing, to check in on them basically, because their lives were changing drastically. They'd been like the centre of attention for so long with being married to a Beatle, but now John had gone, he was divorcing Cynthia, so they were suddenly now going to be put on the back burner. They were going to be out the picture altogether. So Paul wanted to check in on them, make sure they're okay, and in particular see how Julian is doing. Now Paul was also feeling quite mixed feelings about this because ever since they'd moved down to London really, John had been living with Cynthia and Julian out at Weybridge. So Paul had spent a lot of time at that house writing songs with John. This was where they'd done a lot of their collaborating. If they weren't working at Paul's place in Cavendish Avenue, they were working at John's place out in Weybridge. And, you know, for Paul, this was an ending as well, really. This was kind of his last time going there. Anyway, the drive from Cavendish Avenue, where Paul lived, out to Weybridge was about an hour. So Paul had a bit of time to kill while he was on the route there. And he was thinking about Julian in particular. And he started coming up with a song called Hey Jude. And when he arrived, he would play this song to Julian to comfort him, to tell him that, you know, it's not cool. You know, your parents are getting divorced. Yes, it's hard, but you'll be okay. Everything will be all right for you. And that's basically what the song was about to begin with, Hey Jules. And yeah, Paul really liked this. He thought he had quite the basis of a good song here, so he would keep working on it. So once Paul returned home to Cavendish Avenue, he would record a demo for Hey Jules and he would continue working away at the lyrics. Now quite early on in this, he would decide to change the name Jules to Jude just because he felt it flowed better. Hey Jude, it does kind of, in the context of the song, work better than what Hey Jules does. It just has a better ring to it, I suppose. Now do excuse me here because we're going to indulge in a bit of a story. Now this story, it doesn't have to be told in the story of Hey Jude. It's not one that's told all that often, but I really like it. It's a really cool story and I just want to share it in this video basically. So on June 30th, 1968, Paul was in Bradford and he was working with the Black Dyke Mills Band. And once he'd finished working with them there, he would then make his way back to London with Derek Taylor and a couple of other friends. Now on the way down, they decided that they would stop off, and whilst they were in Bedfordshire, they looked at a map and Paul said to Derek Taylor, pick somewhere, just pick somewhere that sounds good. And they picked a place called Harold, simply because they liked the name. So they went to visit this small, unassuming little English village called Harold. Now this is where the story gets really interesting because whilst they were visiting this village, they decided that they would pay a visit to the local pub called the Oakley Arms. Now this was a Sunday night and they're basically in a pub on a Sunday night, most of the people in there, it's going to be the regulars in a little village. It's not going to be like a load of tourists, it's just going to be the same people in there all the time. Now imagine the faces of the regulars in this pub that Sunday night when Paul McCartney walked in, one of the biggest people in the world, one of the biggest names in the world, one of the most famous people on the planet, and he's just walked into this little pub in the middle of nowhere. Now in this pub there was a piano situated and Paul decided eventually that he would go to this piano and he would start a sing-along in the pub. They'd all have a sing-song together. So Paul was sitting at the piano playing away, playing a number of songs, and then he asked the pub goers, do you want to hear a new song? Obviously they said yes. And this is where Paul would debut Hey Jude for the first time. Now it's worth pointing out, on June 30th, 1968, the Beatles hadn't even recorded the song at this point, let alone release it, so nobody in the pub would know this song. John, George and Ringo also probably didn't know about this song's existence at this point. This is how early on in the genesis of the song this story happens. Now, for the performance of this song, this was the first time Paul would ever perform it to the public. He decided he would teach them it. They would teach them the na 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 bit. And yeah, basically Paul started playing this song and the pub joined in singing along, and it was kind of there and then where Paul knew that he had a great song on his hands here. He had a hit single, a potentially really big song. And yeah, basically the night went on. That was the only new song he played that night. He carried on playing songs. They stayed there until the early hours before they eventually left come dawn the following morning, and then went back to London. And that's the story basically. Paul's trip to a little Bedfordshire village pub where he debuted Hey Jude for the first time to a bunch of Sunday night regulars at the pub. I mean, what a brilliant story that is. Paul would thank the pub goers for their excellent evening, for the great time that he had, for putting up with him basically. He sent them a bottle of champagne to say thank you a few weeks later. So yeah, that was the first time Hey Jude got its public debut, and it wasn't even recorded by that point. Brilliant. So we're going to fast forward now to July 26, 1968, and Paul decided it was finally time to debut Hey Jude to John. Now John and Yoko came to visit Paul at Cavendish Avenue that day, and Paul would start playing them the song. And they listened to it, and whilst Paul was singing the line, "The movement you need is on your shoulder," he turned around to John and he said, "It's not a great line that, I know, I'll fix it, I'll make it better." And John said to him, "You will not, it's the best line in the whole song, that." And that's why it stayed in, and to this day Paul claims that every time he sings that line he thinks of John. Now initially when John heard this song, he thought that Paul had written it about him. Basically what he thought Paul was saying subconsciously was, because Yoko was now on the scene and John was now starting to commit more and more of his time to Yoko away from Paul and the Beatles, this was Paul's way of approving of it, basically saying, "Go on John, go out and get her, just leave us, you know, you're alright, you go and do it." It's kind of giving a seal of approval. Now obviously this is not what the song is about, it's actually about Julian. John would eventually find out it's about Julian, and well, he couldn't really say it's a horrible song, he kind of was forced to say it's a great song, which I do think, to be fair, he genuinely did think this was a good song. I don't think any of the Beatles could argue this being a bad song. I mean, I love Obla Di Obla Da, I love Honey Pie, but I can understand why the others would argue against them being great songs. But with this one, there's genuinely no way they could possibly argue against it. So anyway, yes, John liked the fact that this was about Julian, even though he did initially think it was about himself. So the first session for Hey Jude would take place on July 29th, 1968 at Trident Studios in London. Now the Beatles had already decided this early on that this was going to be their next single, so they intentionally decided they wanted to do this at Trident simply so they could have access to an 8-track machine rather than the 4 tracks over at EMI. For this session, the band would mainly just rehearse the song. Paul would play piano and sing a vocal, John would play acoustic guitar, George would play electric guitar, and Ringo would play drums. Now it was early on during these rehearsals that Paul and George would have a little bit of a spat. Basically what was happening was Paul was singing the song, and after he finished each line, George was playing a little bit on the acoustic guitar, something like bing ding ding, that kind of thing, just like answering Paul back on the guitar. So Paul would say something, finish his line, and then George would reply to it with a guitar line. Now Paul didn't like this, and he didn't mince his words with George. Basically he said, "No, we're not doing that, I don't want that on the song, thank you very much." And George wasn't very happy about this. If you watch the Get Back documentary, you can see, it's early on in the Twickenham sessions, that famous argument where George is saying, "I'll play what you want, or I won't play at all, just tell me what it is that'll please you and I'll do it." When the argument's going on, this gets mentioned, this thing with Hey Jude, and Paul telling him, "No, you're not playing guitar like that on this song." You know, so this was kind of a bit of tension in this session between Paul and George. It was nothing drastic really, but yeah, this famous story happened this day, the famous disagreement about the guitar on Hey Jude. It happened this day during the first day's session. Anyway, once the rehearsals had finished, they would eventually record 6 takes this day, but only 3 of them would be complete takes. Now none of these takes would be used going forward. However, take 1 has been subsequently released on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album. It's quite an interesting take actually. It's a bit shorter, not much shorter, it's still like 6 minutes long. But, you know, you can still tell it's Hey Jude at the end of the day. But yeah, it's quite a nice little take to listen to on the 50th anniversary edition of the White Album for your listening pleasure. The following day, July 30th, 1968, work continued on Hey Jude. The band would play the same instruments as the day before. However, George would only play guitar on some early takes before spending the vast amount of this session watching on from the studio control room. Takes 7 to 23 would be recorded this day, and a film crew were also at Trident Studio this day filming the band at work for a documentary by the National Music Council of Great Britain. At the end of this session, a rough mix was created so that George Martin could create a score for the song. I should also point out that the footage you're currently seeing on your screen is from this day's sessions. So the following day, July 31st, 1968, the Beatles decided that they would re-record Hey Jude from scratch and they would therefore lay down 4 new takes of the basic track. Once again, the band played the same instruments as in the previous sessions, and this time George would rejoin the sessions playing the electric guitar. So during one of the takes during this day's session, Ringo went to the toilet and the others didn't realise, so began recording the take without Ringo being at his drum kit. So Ringo, hearing from the toilet that the session had begun, he had to creep back into the studio and sneak onto his drum kits, ready to start drumming when he was needed. And yeah, basically he made it back in time to start doing his drumming. Anyway, of these 4 takes, take 1 would be considered the best to begin adding overdubs to. So the final session for Hey Jude would take place on August 1st, 1968. So firstly, during this session, Paul would overdub his bass guitar onto the track and then would lay down his final lead vocals. However, the main event for this day's session was recording the 36-piece orchestra. Now during the session, the orchestra were asked if for double the fee, they would also contribute some hand claps and backing vocals to the track alongside the orchestration they were here to do. Now 35 of the musicians agreed, although one would refuse, reportedly saying, "I'm not going to clap my hands and sing Paul McCartney's bloody song." Anyway, all 4 Beatles would sing backing vocals on the song alongside 35 of the session musicians, and eventually the track was completed this day and ready to go. I tell you what, thank God there's video footage of the Hey Jude session, because I tell you what, it makes life considerably easier for me from an editing standpoint when there's just video footage that I can use over the video. Makes it a lot easier. Anyway, the Hey Jude single with John Lennon's Revolution as its B-side would be released on the 30th of August 1968, however for some reason it was released 4 days earlier in the US. So this single would also be the first release from Apple Records, the Beatles' new record label. Do you want some chart trivia, folks? Because you're going to get some chart trivia now, so cue the music, pop pickers, here we go! I'm going to read it as well. The single will top the charts all over the world and coming in at over 7 minutes in length, it would be the longest song to ever top the UK charts, a record it would hold until 1998 when Oases all around the world would surpass it in terms of running length. To this day, Hey Jude remains the biggest selling debut release ever on a new record label, and it is still the Beatles' most commercially successful song. Tune in next time, pop pickers! Hi, my name's Ollie and I play the fool. Anyway, Hey Jude, let's get serious. Potentially the Beatles' biggest song, and it probably is. I mean, what is bigger than this? Someone tell me. I mean, some people argue Here Comes the Sun, but Here Comes the Sun was never a single. So in terms of actually released singles, this is genuinely the Beatles' biggest song. I do know that as a fact, pop pickers. But yeah, in terms of actually most well-known song, it probably is their most well-known song, but then there's also Yesterday, there's Here Comes the Sun. Anyway, for me personally, I've got to be honest, I don't listen to this song all that often because I've heard it that much over the years. I'm fed up of hearing it. I don't want to hear it anymore. It's one of those songs for me, and I don't think it helps that Paul to this day is still doing it all the time in concert, and rightfully so I suppose, because although I don't listen to the song, I can't come here and say it's a bad song. It's not a bad song. It is a masterpiece. It is a what's the word? It's perfection in terms of a brilliant craftsman piece in terms of pop music. Probably made more sense in my head that. Basically, in terms of a pop song, this is the perfect pop song. It's got a great set of lyrics, it's got a great melody, and you can sing along with it. I mean, everybody can sing along with this song, even if you don't really know much about the Beatles. As soon as this comes on, you know it. It's one of them songs, you know it. And you can't help but not sing along with it. Even though I don't listen to it that often, whenever it comes on, I can't help but sing along with it. Now, I didn't actually talk about it during the background of the song there, with the in-depthy bit about the song. But, I mean, a lot of people know about this anyway. But if you listen carefully around the 2:55 mark, I think it is, just as it starts going better, better, just before that bit of the song, if you listen very carefully, very deep in the mix, there's a fucking hell that you can hear. You can hear the Beatles saying fucking hell. We don't know which one of them it is. John claims it was Paul and Paul claims it was John, so yeah, we don't know who it is. But they didn't bother removing it. They thought they'd leave it in as a bit of a joke. They just put it really low in the mix. So you won't hear it. You can maybe vaguely hear a noise in the background, but you won't know what it is unless it's pointed out to you. But trust me, once you know it's there, you'll hear it every single time. It's a bit like Mick Jagger singing the backing vocals on Carly Simon's You're So Vain. Once you know it's Mick Jagger, you'll always hear it as Mick Jagger. Same thing here. Once you know there's a fucking hell buried deep in the mix, you'll always hear it. I always hear it. I miss it when they does it live, to be honest, that Paul doesn't include it in the live set. It also means, because it's very deep in the mix, if you hear this song on the radio, it doesn't get censored. So when this song gets played on the radio, you can actually hear fucking hell. I imagine that's part of the reason why the Beatles left it in, just for a bit of a laugh, knowing that it would probably get past the censors, that people wouldn't notice it, so they'd get it played on the radio. Sort of humour they had. I have that kind of humour too. I've got to say as well, I absolutely love the story of Paul playing this song in a pub for the first time. I mean, just imagine that, going into a pub in the middle of nowhere, Paul McCartney walking in and then playing you a new song, especially if that song happens to be Hey Jude. I mean, there is a very small group of people, I don't know how many of them are still alive either, that got to hear Hey Jude before John Lennon, George Harrison and Ringo Starr got to hear it. I mean, that's incredible in itself. Anyway, to conclude here, I can fully understand why this is the Beatles' most commercially successful song. It's fun, it's catchy, it's just an all-round great song. It's a masterpiece really, 10 out of 10. Yeah, great work there, Mr. McCartney. Very good. It's very good, you know. Yeah, alright. So there we have it. That concludes the final ever episode of the White Album in depth. Thank you very much for watching, and especially if you've watched every episode in this series, I seriously do appreciate that. I've loved doing this. Thank you very much for watching all the way through. If you've not seen any of the previous episodes, there is a playlist on my channel that has all 32 episodes in it. Yeah, it's been going a couple of months now since I started this series. It's been going very well. I really much enjoyed doing this. And for those who's asking, yes, I will do this in future for other albums. It might not just be Beatles albums. Well, I'll go in depth with full albums, but I'll also do it for just specific songs here and there. Plus videos like the one that I did for Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, which is kind of just randomy stuff. My next video, although I've already recorded it before doing this one, but you'll be seeing it after this one, makes more sense in my head, is focusing on the Stones from 1968 until 1972. It's a bloody great video, that one. I'm genuinely very proud of it. It's like an hour and 15, I think, in length. But seriously, it's the most work I've ever put into a video, that one that's coming up. So yeah, I'm very proud of it. I think it's turned out pretty well myself. Anyway, yes, thank you very much for watching this series. Anyway, I genuinely really have appreciated all your support on this series. It's been great fun. And yeah, it's been a blast. If there's anything in particular you would like me to focus on, do share it in the comments. I'm not going to say that I'll definitely do it, but I'll at least read it and consider it. In terms of other Beatles albums, I'll probably do Revolver next if I was going to do any of them. But we will see. The time will tell, I suppose. Anyway, for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Till then though, do take care.